It all started with the shredder, a mundane task that should have taken no more than an hour, but instead unraveled the thin veneer of normalcy in my life. My boss, Mr. Walker, had handed me a stack of files with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Dispose of these," he'd said. "Confidential." I had been working for Walker for just 6 months. His commanding presence was matched by his impeccable reputation. CEOs don't reach his stature without playing hardball, I thought, as I fed the first few documents into the machine. But as I went through the files, something caught my eye, a spreadsheet. My stomach clenched when I realized what I was looking at. Numbers that didn't add up, money siphoned into untraceable accounts. At first, I tried to convince myself it was nothing, maybe a clerical error, but my gut knew better. The deeper I dug into the documents, the clearer the pattern became. This was embezzlement on a massive scale. That evening, I stayed late under the guise of finishing reports. I couldn't shake the feeling that the walls had eyes. The office felt oppressively quiet, each creak of the air ducts amplifying my unease. I saved copies of key documents to a hidden folder on my laptop, telling myself it was just a precaution. When I got home, the atmosphere in my apartment felt wrong. The lamp on my bedside table was slightly tilted, and my closet door stood ajar. Things I was certain I hadn't left that way. Paranoia? I told myself, "You're imagining things." But that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. The next morning, my resolve wavered. I thought about going to the authorities, but the fear of retaliation froze me. Walker wasn't just my boss. He was a man with connections, the kind who could make problems and people disappear. Then the subtle threats began. My coffee mug, which I always left on the counter, was found in the sink. My mail was opened, resealed sloppily. I started noticing the same black SUV parked near my building, no matter what time I came or went. One night, I found my personal journal, something I never took to the office, spread open on my kitchen counter. My hands trembled as I turned the pages, seeing his name underlined in red ink. He was in my home. Finally, I decided to confront him. Perhaps it was sheer stupidity or the bottled-up rage of being toyed with. But I marched into his office with the damning evidence in hand. Walker didn't flinch. Instead, he chuckled a low, menacing sound that made the hair on my neck stand up. "You've been busy," he said, flipping through the pages I'd printed. I opened my mouth to respond, but he cut me off. "Do you know what happens to people who can't mind their own business?" He leaned forward, his smile devoid of any warmth. "They disappear." I left the office in a daze, barely noticing the driver tailing me all the way home. That night, I packed a bag and booked a one-way ticket to a city where I hoped he couldn't reach me. But even now, as I type this from an anonymous motel room, I can feel his presence. The subtle rearrangements of my belongings, the unshakable sensation of eyes on the back of my neck. It's all still happening. Walker always said the best predators never had to chase their prey. They simply waited. The email arrived with a crisp, professional tone. "Congratulations, Mr. and Mrs. Carter. You've been selected for the Silverwood Corporate Relocation Program. Your new home awaits in our picturesque community, complete with complimentary housing, exceptional schools, and unparalleled opportunities. We weren't looking to move, but the offer was impossible to ignore. A new life in a quiet town with better benefits than I'd ever imagined. The company even offered to cover moving costs. My husband, Tom, was ecstatic. Our two kids, Maggie and Ethan, buzzed with excitement as they packed their belongings. The town of Silverwood was exactly as described. Clean, friendly, idyllic. The house they gave us was spacious and modern, with a backyard that stretched into a perfectly manicured park. The neighbors were overwhelmingly welcoming, stopping by with baskets of baked goods and invitations to barbecues. It was almost surreal. 3 weeks in, I noticed something odd. The family across the street, the Palmers, suddenly disappeared. Their house stood eerily quiet, curtains drawn, no signs of life. When I asked our neighbor, Carla, what happened, she smiled too brightly. Oh, they decided to move on. It's all for the best. Her tone felt rehearsed, like something she'd practiced saying. I didn't press further, but the words settled uneasily in my mind. It's all for the best. It wasn't the last time I'd hear that phrase. My son Ethan repeated it one morning as he laced his shoes for school. My husband used it casually over dinner in a way that didn't quite fit the conversation. Maggie whispered it to herself while brushing her hair. The repetition began to feel deliberate, as though they were parroting something they'd been told. Determined to find answers, I started digging. Late at night, I pored over local records, but everything about Silverwood seemed curated, sterilized. Social media accounts were sparse, with little more than cheerful photos of neighborhood events. No one mentioned the Palmers, and when I asked others, they deflected with generic comments about people coming and going. The final straw came when Tom began changing, too. He was no longer the man I knew. His laugh felt hollow, his responses carefully measured. When I asked if he'd noticed anything strange about the town, he just smiled. Relax, honey. It's all for the best. One evening, I overheard a conversation between Maggie and Ethan in hushed tones. Ethan said something about graduating, and Maggie replied, "But what if we fail?" When I stepped into the room, they fell silent, staring at me with wide, guilty eyes. Something was being hidden from me, and whatever it was, my own family was part of it. The next day, I tried to call a friend from my old city, only to discover that my phone couldn't connect to numbers outside the town's area code. My work emails bounced back. Every attempt to reach someone outside Silverwood failed. It felt like the town was sealing me in, cutting me off from the world. Desperate, I waited until Tom and the kids were asleep and drove to the Palmer's house. The door was unlocked. Inside, everything was eerily staged, as though meant to look normal at a glance. A coffee mug sat on the counter, still full. A calendar on the wall displayed last month's dates. But the silence was overwhelming, like the house itself was holding its breath. In the basement, I found stacks of documents. They detailed employment histories, medical records, and psychological profiles, all stamped with the logo of the corporation that had brought us here. At the bottom of the stack, I found something worse, photos of my family. Tom, Maggie, Ethan, and me, all labeled Phase 2. When I returned home, Tom was waiting in the living room. He wasn't angry, but his expression was unnervingly calm. "You shouldn't have gone there," he said quietly. "We're being evaluated. Compliance ensures success. Resistance," he trailed off, then repeated with an empty smile, "it's all for the best." I'm writing this now from the library, where the cameras don't seem to reach. I can feel the town closing in around me. Every neighbor's smile hides a secret. Every street corner whispers the same refrain. And my own family, piece by piece, is slipping away. The acceptance letter came embossed in gold, smelling faintly of lavender. I held it with trembling hands, disbelief surging through me. St. Latham's Academy was the sort of school you read about in novels. Ivy-covered buildings, elite alumni, the gateway to a life of unparalleled success. And now, thanks to an unexpected full scholarship, my daughter Ivy would be walking through its grand gates. The orientation was a blur of smiling administrators and other parents who oozed wealth and connections. We were handed thick manuals of school policies, detailing everything from meal plans to behavior monitoring. I skimmed the pages, noting the section on student conduct evaluations. It seemed unusually specific. The first week, Ivy came home glowing. She loved her classes, her teachers, the sprawling campus. But the glow dimmed by the second week. She stopped talking as much, and when she did, her responses were clipped. One evening, while I was making dinner, she sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly at the manual. "I have to report my day in detail," she said suddenly. "Everything I do, every thought I have." I turned from the stove. "What do you mean?" "It's part of the scholarship," she murmured. "They watch everything." I laughed uneasily, brushing it off as her misinterpreting an assignment. But when I glanced at the manual later that night, I saw it buried in dense legal jargon. Students receiving financial aid consent to behavioral assessments, including real-time monitoring. Real-time monitoring? It sounded invasive, but I convinced myself it was just a high-tech educational tool. Then the messages started. The first came while I was folding laundry. A text buzzed on my phone from an unknown number. "Ensure Ivy completes her weekly reflection before 9 p.m. I froze, the basket slipping from my hands. My chest tightened as I stared at the words. How did they know Ivy hadn't submitted it yet? I rushed upstairs and found her on her bed, typing furiously into her tablet. "They remind me if I'm late," she said without looking up. Her voice was flat, mechanical. By the third month, our lives revolved around the academy. Ivy stopped doing things she used to love, drawing, reading novels, and spent her free time completing endless forms and quizzes about her commitment to growth. One night, I found her awake at 2 a.m., red-eyed and trembling. "They'll know if I don't finish," she whispered. I called the school, demanding to know why my child was being pushed so hard. The administrator's tone was placid, almost robotic. "Mrs. Archer, Ivy's scholarship depends on her participation in our evaluation program. These methods prepare students for the discipline required in the real world. It's all outlined in your agreement." I hung up, my pulse racing. Agreement? I hadn't signed up for this. I fumbled through my files until I found the scholarship documents. There, in the fine print, were terms I'd barely registered. The institution retains the right to implement psychological methodologies for academic and behavioral development. Determined to pull her out, I visited the school the next day. But when I arrived at the headmistress's office, she greeted me with a knowing smile. "Mrs. Archer, we understand your concerns. Removing Ivy would be highly detrimental to her and to you." The words felt like a threat, their meaning hanging ominously between us. She slid a piece of paper across the desk. It was a copy of the scholarship contract signed in my handwriting. At the bottom, a line I hadn't seen before. "Termination of enrollment grants the Academy limited guardianship rights." "What is this?" I stammered. "Standard procedure for scholarship recipients. We're invested in Ivy's success, and we will ensure she stays on track." I stormed out, my heart pounding, vowing to fight. That night, I packed bags for both of us, ready to leave town. But Ivy was gone. Her room was pristine, her tablet missing from her desk. My phone buzzed with a single message. "Ivy is being relocated for advanced evaluation. You will receive further instructions soon." I collapsed into the chair, the weight of my decision crushing me. In trying to give her a better life, I'd handed her over to strangers. And now, the silence of the house around me was deafening. I was hesitant the moment I got the email. Urgent. Overnight delivery needed. $10,000 payment upon completion. No names. No center details. Just a time, a place, and a task. Normally, I wouldn't give something like this a second glance, but the amount was hard to ignore. Bills were piling up, and desperation was a constant weight on my shoulders. When I arrived at the pickup location, a nondescript warehouse in the industrial part of town, I felt out of place. The door creaked open, and a man in a suit greeted me. He didn't introduce himself. "This is the package," he said, placing a small, locked briefcase on the table between us. "Deliver it to this address by 6 a.m. No stops, no questions." I nodded, feeling the tension in the air like static electricity. He slid an envelope across the table. "Half now, half on delivery." Inside were crisp $100 bills, enough to make me ignore every warning bell going off in my head. The drive was long, the highways empty under the cover of darkness. The briefcase sat on the passenger's seat, unnervingly quiet, as if it had a presence of its own. I told myself not to look inside. Just deliver it, get paid, and forget about it. But after 2 hours of driving, curiosity clawed at me. Pulling into an empty rest stop, I fumbled with the lock. It didn't take much to pry it open. Inside were documents, encrypted files, black and white photographs of people I didn't recognize, and something that made my stomach twist. A dossier labeled Target. Neutralization required. The accompanying photo was of a well-known politician, their face circled in red ink. My hands shook as I slammed the case shut. I was back on the highway when I noticed it. Headlights in the rearview mirror. At first, I thought it was just another driver. But as the miles stretched on, the car didn't pass me. It didn't fall back. It stayed, a constant shadow in the dark. Sweat prickled on my forehead as panic set in. My foot pressed harder on the accelerator. The car behind me matched my speed, its intentions unmistakable. It wasn't just following me, it was hunting me. When I took an unexpected exit, the car followed. I turned sharply onto a narrow back road, my tires skidding on the gravel. My heart pounded as the headlights loomed closer, bathing the interior of my car in blinding white. They wanted the briefcase, I realized, and they were willing to do whatever it took to get it. Reaching into the glove compartment, I grabbed my phone, fumbling to dial 911. Before I could press call, the pursuing car rammed into my rear bumper, sending me swerving. The phone slipped from my grasp, clattering onto the floor. I spotted an old service station ahead, its flickering neon sign like a beacon in the night. With a burst of speed, I pulled into the lot, slamming the brakes. I jumped out, clutching the briefcase, and sprinted inside. The place was deserted, the air thick with the smell of gasoline and stale coffee. The distant rumble of the pursuing car grew louder. I ducked behind a row of shelves, trying to steady my breathing. The glass door swung open, and footsteps echoed through the empty station. I held the briefcase tightly, every instinct screaming at me to run. A shadow passed between the aisles. Whoever it was, they weren't in a hurry. They knew I was cornered. "Just leave the case," a voice called out. It was calm, measured, almost conversational. "We don't want you. Only what you're carrying." I stayed silent, gripping the briefcase like it was my lifeline. I could hear them moving closer. A creak, a shuffle. My pulse thundered in my ears. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the footsteps retreated. The door swung shut. I waited, heart hammering, before daring to peek around the corner. The parking lot was empty, my car sitting untouched. I drove the rest of the way, without stopping, arriving at the delivery point just as the first hints of dawn painted the horizon. A man in sunglasses met me outside a dimly lit motel. He said nothing, just took the briefcase and handed me an envelope. "Good work," he said, his tone devoid of warmth. As I drove home, the envelope sat on the seat beside me, thick with cash. But all I could think about was the weight of the briefcase, the car that had followed me, and the politician's face circled in red. I delivered the package, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just become part of something far bigger and far darker than I could ever understand. The call came at 3:47 a.m., dragging me from a fitful sleep. The dispatcher's voice was calm but urgent. "We've got a hostage situation at the First Union Bank. You're needed now." 15 years of experience as a hostage negotiator hadn't dulled the edge these calls brought. I dressed quickly, ignoring the familiar weight of unease settling in my chest. By the time I arrived, the downtown streets were barricaded, flashing blue and red lights, casting harsh shadows against the towering buildings. The scene was chaos, as expected. Officers were scrambling for position, SWAT gearing up. I was ushered into a makeshift command center where a tired-looking captain handed me a headset. "They're asking for you by name, Harper," he said. That was my first red flag. The initial contact was textbook. A man with a gruff voice introduced himself as Simon and laid out his demands: safe passage, a vehicle, and access to a specific safety deposit box. "What's in the box?" I asked, my voice steady, neutral. That's not your concern, he snapped. You give me the box, or people die. There were 8 hostages, all bank employees. Through the surveillance feeds, I could see them huddled near the teller stations, hands on their heads, trembling. I'd done this enough times to know the robbers weren't amateurs. Their movements were methodical, their voices controlled. What struck me was their singular focus on the safety deposit box. They didn't touch the cash, not even glancing at the vault. As the hours dragged on, I worked to buy time. Simon wasn't giving me much to work with, but I noticed something odd. Every time I tried to steer the conversation, he faltered, as if he were reading from a script. That was my second red flag. During a break, I pressed the captain for more information. What's so important about this deposit box? His expression tightened. It's classified. Need to know. I stared at him, frustration boiling under my professional veneer. I need to know if I'm going to save these people. He hesitated, then motioned me aside. The box contains evidence. Sensitive evidence. If it gets out, it could ruin lives, ours included. Back at the negotiation, I decided to push Simon. You're not here for the money, are you? This isn't about a payday. There was a long silence on the line before he replied, his tone icy. We all have debts to pay. It was a cryptic response, but I'd struck a nerve. I pressed further, probing for cracks in his resolve. The more he talked, the clearer it became. This wasn't his plan. He was following orders, and whoever was pulling the strings had far more at stake. Meanwhile, the SWAT team was preparing for an assault. We can't wait forever, the captain warned. We got a clear shot at one of them. But something about this felt off. I'd been trained to trust my instincts, and every instinct screamed that storming the bank would end in bloodshed. I pleaded for more time, stalling both the team and Simon. Then one of the hostages did something unexpected. A young woman in her 20s broke free from the group, running toward the nearest exit. Through the feed, I saw one of the robbers aim at her, then hesitate. He lowered his weapon. That was my third red flag. I pieced it together in a rush of clarity. The robbers weren't killers. They weren't even in control. They were being used, just like me, as pawns in a much larger game. I returned to the line. Simon listened to me. Whatever they promised you, it's not worth it. This box isn't your salvation. It's your undoing. He laughed, a dry, humorless sound. You think I don't know that? Before I could respond, a deafening bang erupted in the feed. It's what it moved in. The screen blurred with chaos, gunfire, smoke, bodies scrambling. My headset buzzed with panicked voices. When the dust settled, the hostages were safe, but the robbers were either dead or in custody. The deposit box, however, was gone. Later, in the cold quiet of the station, I reviewed the aftermath. None of the surviving robbers knew who had hired them. Their instructions had come anonymously, their motives obscured by layers of misdirection. Weeks later, I received an unmarked envelope at my door. Inside was a single photograph, grainy, black and white, showing me speaking into the headset that morning. On the back, written in neat block letters, were the words, "You saved them, but at what cost?" The weight of that question lingers, more oppressive than any I've faced before. You said, I'd been desperate, crashing on a friend's couch after losing my previous place. My savings were dwindling, and I couldn't be picky. The listed rent was absurdly cheap for the city. It felt too good to be true, but I didn't have the luxury of asking too many questions. The landlord, a man who introduced himself as Mr. Harlow, met me at the apartment. He wore a threadbare blazer and smelled faintly of mothballs. The unit was small but clean, with high ceilings and a single window overlooking an alley. "This place won't last long," he said, jingling a set of keys. "If you're interested, you'd better decide now." I signed the lease without thinking twice. The first week was uneventful. I spent my evenings unpacking and my days job hunting. The building was oddly quiet. I'd yet to see another tenant, though I occasionally heard muffled footsteps in the hallway or the low hum of a television from somewhere nearby. It wasn't until the second week that things started to feel off. It began with the door. Every time I left for errands or interviews, I locked it. But when I returned, it would be slightly ajar, just enough to make me stop short in the hallway. Nothing ever seemed to be missing or disturbed, but the sight of that crack in the doorway began to gnaw at me. I called Mr. Harlow. His response was casual, dismissive. "The old locks can be tricky. Might want to give it an extra twist when you lock up." Then came the noises. Late at night, I'd hear faint whispers through the vents, too low to make out the words, but unmistakably human. One night, I pressed my ear against the wall, trying to pinpoint the source. The voices stopped immediately, as if they'd been listening to me just as I was to them. I stopped sleeping well, jolting awake at every creak of the floorboards or groan of the pipes. I told myself it was just an old building, my nerves getting the better of me. But the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave. The breaking point came on a Sunday. I just returned from a trip to the laundromat, the scent of detergent still clinging to my clothes. My door was open again, wide this time, swinging gently on its hinges. Inside, my apartment was pristine, but there was one glaring anomaly: my bookshelf. The rows of books, which I'd alphabetized meticulously, were rearranged by size, tallest to shortest. A tiny, precise change, but one I couldn't ignore. Someone had been inside. I grabbed my phone and called Mr. Harlow. This time, he didn't answer. Frustrated, I decided to confront him in person. I marched down the hall to his listed apartment, only to find the door locked and the unit eerily silent. A neighbor poked their head out of a nearby door, their expression wary. "Are you looking for Harlow?" they asked. "Yes." "Do you know where he is?" Their brow furrowed. No one's lived in that unit for years. My stomach dropped. I returned to my apartment and locked the door, double-checking the bolt. Then I pulled out my phone and tried to find the Craigslist ad. It was gone. No trace of the listing. My text to the number I'd been given went unanswered, and when I called, the line was disconnected. I spent the rest of the day combing through every inch of the apartment, looking for cameras, hidden microphones, anything to explain what was happening. Nothing. But that night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the whispers returned. Louder this time, clearer. They weren't coming from the vents anymore. They were in the room. The next morning, I packed a bag and left. I didn't bother locking the door behind me. When I reached the building's front desk to turn in my keys, the clerk looked puzzled. "There's no record of a tenant in that unit," she said, flipping through a ledger. "Are you sure you're in the right place?" I left the keys on the counter and walked out into the street. Behind me, the building loomed, its facade as ordinary as any other in the city. But I knew the truth now. It wasn't just an apartment. It was a trap, a place that pulled people in, erased them, and waited patiently for the next tenant to sign their name. I sat in the corner of the boardroom, the sleek glass table reflecting the blinding overhead lights. Surrounding me were representatives from Elcor International, a conglomerate known for its philanthropic investments. To anyone else, this was a golden opportunity. Our struggling nonprofit partnering with a global powerhouse. But the air felt heavy, charged with an unspoken tension. "We're excited to fund your initiatives," said Mr. Kavanaugh, their lead representative. His words dripped with charm, but his eyes told a different story. "Of course, we'll need certain adjustments to ensure our mutual goals align." Adjustments. That was the word he'd used the last time, too. Back then, it was a request to reroute some funding toward a community survey. That survey, I later learned, involved discrete data collection on impoverished neighborhoods, names, addresses, income levels. It felt invasive, wrong, but we'd been desperate for the money, so I had signed off. This time, their ask was far darker. They wanted access to our beneficiary lists under the guise of streamlining aid. I pushed back, pointing out the confidentiality agreements we'd made with our recipients. Kavanaugh's smile didn't falter, but his tone hardened. "Transparency is key in partnerships. Surely you understand that." I nodded, but the unease simmering in my gut wouldn't settle. The meeting ended with promises of follow-ups and a thinly veiled warning. We needed to play ball if we wanted their continued support. That night, I went home to my cramped apartment, the weight of the day pressing on my chest. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The windows felt too open, the walls too thin. I drew the curtains and double-checked the locks, but the unease stayed with me. By midnight, I convinced myself it was just stress. But as I prepared for bed, my phone buzzed. An email from an unknown sender. "You're asking too many questions." I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. The subject line was blank, and the email contained no other text. My first instinct was to delete it, but I hesitated, instead forwarding it to a secure account before logging out of my work email entirely. The next day, I arrived at the office to find a new advisor from Elcor waiting in the lobby. Ms. Harlow, a sharp-dressed woman with an unreadable expression, claimed she was there to assist with the integration process. Her presence unnerved me. She moved through the office like she owned it, her sharp eyes scanning every file, every computer screen. I tried to maintain composure, but my unease grew when I noticed her snapping photos of documents with her phone. That evening, I pulled the staff into a private meeting. We agreed to tighten data access and double-check our systems for unauthorized changes. But as I left the office, I noticed Harlow watching me from across the street, her silhouette just barely visible beneath the street lamp. The breaking point came a week later. I received a package at home, a stack of glossy brochures promoting a new initiative under our nonprofit's name. Only, I hadn't approved this initiative. The focus was surveillance programs under the guise of community safety. My stomach churned as I flipped through the pages. This wasn't aid, it was control. The wording implied partnerships with law enforcement, even private security firms, to monitor low-income areas. It felt like our organization was becoming a tool for corporate oppression. I called an emergency board meeting. To my shock, most of my colleagues were already on board with the plan. "It's funding," one of them said dismissively. "You're overthinking this." The room turned against me as I argued. They saw me as the obstacle, the idealist clinging to principles in a world run by pragmatists. That night, I made a decision. I accessed the office server, pulling every document I could find related to Elcor's involvement. It was worse than I imagined. The funding wasn't aid. It was a means of control, tracking movements, habits, even political affiliations of the people we were supposed to help. By morning, I had enough evidence to go public. But as I prepared to leave, my phone buzzed again. Another email, this one with an attachment. A photo of me at my desk, taken the night before. The message read, "Don't. I'm still debating my next move." The weight of it all is unbearable. Knowing that speaking out could ruin me, but staying silent would make me complicit. Every glance from a coworker, every car that passes too slowly on my street, feels like a threat. The partnership may have started as our salvation, but now it feels like a noose tightening around us all. The notice came in the middle of the night. A sharp knock at my door and a flyer slipped beneath it. Mandatory evacuation. Effective immediately. The flyer didn't explain much. A vague mention of environmental concerns and a warning to leave everything behind. I'd been a journalist long enough to recognize a cover-up when I saw one. But the urgency in the air outside was palpable. My neighbors, usually loud and leisurely, were rushing to pack cars, their voices low and tense. It wasn't panic, it was fear. Quiet, calculated fear. I grabbed my press badge and recorder before heading out. The streets were choked with vehicles, and the hum of helicopters overhead made it clear this wasn't just a precaution. I flagged down an officer directing traffic, flashing my badge. "You can't stay here," he barked, but I pressed him for answers. He wouldn't budge, only muttering, "Orders are orders." When I mentioned being with the press, his demeanor shifted. After a tense pause, he leaned closer. "You can stay officially, but you won't like what you find." Then he handed me a sealed envelope with an official emblem stamped on it. "You didn't get this from me." By dawn, the city was deserted. Streets once buzzing with life were eerily quiet. Trash blew across empty sidewalks, shop doors hung ajar, and the occasional car sat abandoned. My steps echoed unnaturally as I walked toward the heart of downtown, trying to make sense of it all. I opened the envelope. Inside was a set of coordinates and a single line of text. "Observe, but do not interfere." The coordinates led me to an intersection near the financial district. What struck me first wasn't the silence. It was the cameras. Hundreds of them, mounted on light poles and buildings, all pointed at the streets below. They weren't the standard security cameras you'd see in any major city. These were heavy-duty, military-grade devices, their lenses sweeping in slow, methodical arcs. At the center of the intersection stood a lone figure, a woman dressed in a simple white jumpsuit. She appeared calm, even serene, as she walked in deliberate circles. The cameras followed her every move. As I moved closer, I noticed a faint hum in the air, a low, mechanical vibration that seemed to emanate from the ground itself. I crouched behind an overturned bench, pulling out my recorder. The woman's steps were precise, almost rhythmic. She would pause occasionally, glance at one of the cameras, and then continue. It felt like a test. But a test of what? I wanted to approach her, ask her what was going on, but something stopped me. The cameras seemed too deliberate, their focus unyielding. I had the chilling sense that if I stepped into their frame, they wouldn't just record me, they would act on it. As the hours wore on, I began to notice patterns. Drones hovered high above, barely visible against the cloudy sky. Trucks rolled through the city at odd intervals, their engines eerily silent. They weren't collecting debris or providing aid. They were leaving something behind. I couldn't see what, but the faint hum grew stronger after each pass. By nightfall, the woman was gone. In her place stood another figure, this one a man in a similar jumpsuit. He moved in the same rhythmic patterns, the cameras adjusting smoothly to track him. It was as if they were gathering data, cataloging every twitch, every glance. My phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. You need to leave. Now. Ignoring the warning, I made my way to one of the trucks parked a few blocks away. The back was open, revealing rows of identical white jumpsuits. Alongside them were crates of small, unmarked devices. I picked one up, a smooth black disc with no visible buttons or markings. It vibrated faintly in my hand. Before I could inspect it further, the truck's engine roared to life. I barely had time to duck out of sight as it sped off, leaving behind a suffocating cloud of exhaust. I returned to my apartment under cover of darkness, only to find the door ajar. Inside, every drawer and cabinet had been emptied, my files and equipment gone. On the counter sat another envelope. This one was empty, save for a single phrase scrawled in red ink. You've been seen. Now, days later, I'm writing this from a motel far outside the city. I still don't know what I witnessed, an experiment, a cover-up, or something else entirely. What I do know is this: whatever they were doing wasn't about safety. It was about control. The call came in as I was finishing paperwork, a shooting, high profile, downtown. By the time I arrived at the scene, the place was a circus. Flashing lights reflected off glass towers. Officers swarmed the cordoned-off block, and news crews jostled for footage. A man lay sprawled near the curb, his suit crumpled and blood pooling beneath him. I recognized him immediately. Alan Weiss, CEO of a tech conglomerate with deep political ties. This wasn't just a crime scene, it was a career-defining case. The investigation moved fast. Too fast. Within a week, we had a suspect. Julian Ortega, a disgruntled ex-employee with a history of threats against Weiss. His prints were on the weapon, his alibi full of holes. It all lined up neatly, almost too neatly. But the brass wanted results, and Ortega fit the narrative perfectly. By the time the trial began, I'd moved on to other cases. Then 6 months later, I got the call. Ortega, now serving life in prison, wanted to speak to me. I met him in a sterile interview room, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows on his gaunt face. "You know I didn't do it," he said, his voice hoarse but steady. I leaned back, crossing my arms. "Your prints were on the gun. Your threats are on record. Convince me otherwise." "They framed me," he snapped. "You think I'm some mastermind?" "They handed me that gun, told me to be at the plaza. I didn't even know what was happening until it was too late." His words gnawed at me, but I couldn't show it. "Who's they?" He leaned in, his eyes narrowing. "Ask your department." I left the prison unsettled, Ortega's words echoing in my mind. Back at the precinct, I pulled the case file. Everything was there. Witness statements, forensic reports, surveillance footage. But as I sifted through it, small inconsistencies began to emerge. The security footage had gaps, moments where the camera angles conveniently changed or the timestamp skipped. Witness statements that had seemed airtight now read as rehearsed. And the gun? The chain of custody report was missing. I started asking questions quietly at first. A colleague brushed me off. "You're overthinking it. The guy's a nutcase." But then the warnings began. A sticky note left on my desk. "Drop it." My work email flagged as compromised. My car's brake line mysteriously severed. The tipping point came when I found a USB drive in my mailbox. It contained raw footage from the crime scene, footage that had never made it into the official file. In it, a shadowy figure was seen placing the gun on the ground, wearing gloves. I brought the evidence to my captain, thinking I could trust him. He barely glanced at it before dismissing me. "The case is closed, Harper. You're digging a hole you don't want to fall into." His tone wasn't just dismissive, it was threatening. That night, my apartment was broken into. Nothing was taken, but my files, my notes, everything I'd been collecting was gone. In their place, a single sheet of paper lay on my desk. "Stop." Now I knew this wasn't just about Ortega. Someone higher up had orchestrated this, and they were using me as a pawn to legitimize it. But the more I uncovered, the more dangerous it became. Every attempt to dig deeper was met with roadblocks. Uncooperative colleagues, altered records, surveillance that felt a little too close. I couldn't trust anyone. Even those I thought were friends started to distance themselves, their voices tinged with nervousness whenever I called. I was alone. A week later, I was suspended. The official reason was misconduct, but I knew the truth. They wanted me silenced. My badge and gun were taken, but I still had the USB drive. That was my ticket to exposing the truth. Or so I thought. I arranged a meeting with a journalist, someone I trusted from my years in the field. We met at a diner on the outskirts of town, the USB hidden in a coffee cup sleeve. But as I slid it across the table, she froze, her eyes darting to the window. Two men in black suits stood outside, watching us. Without a word, she stood, grabbed her bag, and left. The USB sat untouched between us. I'm writing this now from a motel room, somewhere far from home. The USB is still with me, but every time I consider uploading it, the weight of what could happen stops me. Ortega was right. This goes deeper than I could have imagined. And now, every shadow feels like a threat. Every knock on the door could be my last. It started with a voicemail. "Hey, can you swing by my place? There's something I need to talk about." My brother's voice sounded strained, almost muffled, like he was speaking from the other end of a long tunnel. I hadn't seen Danny in months. He was always reclusive, but this felt different. His voicemail gave no details, and when I called back, his number went straight to voicemail. Something felt off, so I decided to stop by his apartment the next morning. His building was old, the kind of place where the elevator creaked with every floor and the air smelled faintly of mildew. I knocked on his door, expecting him to answer, but there was only silence. When I tried the knob, it turned easily, unlocked. Inside, everything was too neat. Danny was a slob, a man whose life was a collection of takeout containers and mismatched socks. But now his apartment looked staged, like a rental property ready for a viewing. The couch cushions were perfectly arranged, the coffee table bare except for a single framed photo of our family. A photo I didn't remember ever being taken. I walked through the apartment calling his name. The kitchen was spotless, the sink dry. His bedroom was empty except for a neatly made bed in an open closet. It felt like he'd vanished, but not abruptly. Whoever left this apartment had done so carefully, deliberately. Then I saw it, a note taped to the bathroom mirror. My name was scrawled across it in Danny's handwriting. "Don't trust them." I felt a chill crawl up my spine. Don't trust who? I checked the bathroom, but it was as pristine as the rest of the place. No answers there. On my way out, I noticed something else. The neighbors' doors were slightly ajar, just like Danny's had been. I peeked into the nearest one, only to find the same unnervingly sterile setup. An empty living room, a single photo of the occupant on the mantle, no personal touches. It didn't feel right, but before I could investigate further, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned to see a woman standing in the hallway, dressed in a crisp black suit. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice sharp but pleasant. "I'm looking for my brother," I said, trying to keep my tone steady. "Danny. He lives here." Her smile widened. "I'm sorry, but you must be mistaken. No one named Danny lives in this building." I left in a hurry, her gaze following me all the way to the elevator. Once outside, I pulled up Danny's contact info on my phone, scrolling through old messages. His last text from 3 weeks ago simply said, "They're everywhere." I decided to dig deeper. Over the next few days, I reached out to Danny's coworkers, his friends, anyone who might have seen him. But no one had heard from him in weeks. Even his landlord claimed to have no record of him living in the building. Then the messages started. At first, it was just blank text from unknown numbers. Then came the emails, short cryptic phrases like "stop looking" and "you're next." One night, while combing through Danny's social media for clues, I noticed something disturbing. His accounts had been wiped clean. No posts, no photos, nothing to show he'd ever existed. Even the few tagged photos I had with him on my own profile were gone. Panic set in. It was as if someone was erasing him piece by piece, not just from his apartment, but from the world. Desperate, I returned to his building. This time it was empty. Every door in the hallway stood open, revealing apartments as sterile and lifeless as Danny's. At the end of the corridor, I found a room filled with computer monitors, each displaying live feeds of various parts of the building and of me. The screen closest to the door showed a live feed of my brother's apartment, except it wasn't empty. Danny was sitting on the couch, staring straight ahead, motionless. His face looked pale, almost waxy. I ran back to his apartment, but when I opened the door, the room was empty again. No danni, no furniture, just bare walls and floors. I'm writing this now from a friend's spare room, trying to piece together what happened. The messages have stopped, but the fear hasn't. I don't know who they are or why they took Danny, but I know one thing for sure. Whoever or whatever was watching me in that building hasn't stopped.
Don't forget to subscribe. You are the best.